means that it makes the postsynaptic neuron more likely to fire, and inhibitory means it makes it less likely to fire. Excuse me. So myelin sheath surrounds axons and insulates them and prevent the message from spreading. So this picture is kind of comparing a myelinated and a non-myelinated axon, and as you see, what it means is that this electrical charge can't easily come out when there is a myelin sheath versus when there isn't. So the internal structures of a neuron, there is the cell membrane, just like all the other cells of the body have membranes. It's a lipid bilayer that defines the boundary of the cell and controls the transportation of molecules in and out of the neuron. And it's actually very important and complicated. Later we'll get to how there are different channels, like little doors that either open or not open, depending on what they want to allow into the neuron or not allow. Cytoplasm, again, it's just like other cells, kind of. It's jelly-like fluid that contains the organelles. There is nucleus that produces ribosome that synthesizes protein, and it has DNA or genes in it, in the nucleus, just like other cells, right? A cytoskeleton, also the name kind of explains itself, gives a neuron its volume and shape. It's just like a skeleton of a neuron. And it contains microtubules, actin filaments, and intermediate filaments. What are microtubules? They're like tubes that transport substances from place to place within the axon. And that's called exoplasmic transport. So you want to know the exoplasmic transport takes place through microtubules, and what it does is transportation of substances from different parts of the neuron. And then we have two kinds of endoplasmic reticulum, also, or ER, inside of a neuron. There's rough ER and smooth ER. Rough ER produces proteins, and smooth ER spreads molecules that are involved in different cellular processes and make fat. So you can kind of think about protein kind of seems to be more rough than fat. Fat's more soft. So rough ER makes protein and smooth makes fat or lipids. Same thing. So Schwann cells are the cells that produce myelin sheath in the peripheral nervous system. So it's important that Schwann cells are only in the peripheral, and oligodendrocytes in the central nervous system make the myelin sheath, and that's what a myelin sheath looks like. Each segment of the myelin is produced by one Schwann cell that wraps around the axon and produce this, what we call myelin tube. There is also a blood-brain barrier that is very important because our brain is the most sensitive organ that we have, right? And kind of throughout the evolution, we have evolved to take better care of it than the rest of the body. So your blood vessels throughout the body have little gaps, like you can see in this left-hand side picture. They have gaps, and they make it easier for molecules to go in and out of the blood. So when something is injected into your blood, or you eat it, or whatever, smoke it, whatever it might be, it goes into your blood stream. And in the rest of your body, there are these gaps in the blood vessels that easily allow the molecules to go from the blood into the organ. But brain, because it kind of like protects itself, those gaps aren't there, they're closed to not let things like toxins get easily to the brain.
You see how it says that Schwann cells produce just one segment of the myelin sheath in PNS?
Yeah.
And CNS with oligodendrocytes, right? Is it the same deal, just one produces one sheath?
If I remember correctly, actually it's only the Schwann cells that is one-on-one. So one Schwann cell makes one segment of the myelin. I think with oligodendrocytes that's not the case, but I'm not positive. I gotta look into that. So But something very interesting about this blood-brain barrier is that there is this area behind your head that the blood-brain barrier doesn't exist. So the vessels are, in that part of the brain, the vessels are like the rest of the body. They lack this BBB, and they have the gaps. And what's cool about it is that that part of the brain is responsible for vomiting. So the reason why the blood-brain barrier doesn't exist there, because it allows your brain to detect the toxin fast and throw up. So that's why when people like drink a large amount of alcohol in a short time, they throw up, because then it gets detected and tell your stomach that what you are sending into your bloodstream is not good. Get rid of it, and then that like make you feel nauseated. So selectively permeable barrier between the blood and the brain. The barrier functions to regulate the chemical composition of the extracellular fluid that surrounds the brain, and it's more permeable in some areas. So it's also important that it's not the same everywhere. Blood-brain barrier is not the same everywhere. It's more permeable in some areas than others, and area posterama is the one that I just talked about that kind of makes you throw up, which I think is really cool. Okay, so the human's brain, proportional to the body weight, is bigger and heavier than other species. And that has allowed us and our other cousins, primates, to do things that, some of them, that other species can't do. So the advantages of having a big brain. So the weight of our brain compared to our total weight is 2.3%. 2.3% of our body weight is our brain, which is a larger brain compared to other species. So it allows us to use tools, to have color vision, to stand upright, to have language, be able to communicate through speaking. So you want to know what are the advantages of having a big brain are also. Neurogenesis, that means production of new neurons. So since we're born until I think age of 25, our brain is not fully developed. So your brains are still changing until you're 25, unless you're past 25. But when we say in adult, we're talking about after 25. Only 2 parts of the brain in grown-up people make new neurons, and that's olfactory bulb and hippocampus. Hippocampus is because it's responsible for learning and memory, it has to constantly produce new neurons with the new information. So you're always adding to your knowledge and your memory, and that takes place in hippocampus. And in order for that to happen, it needs to produce new neurons. So only 2 parts of the brain produce new neurons in grown-ups, and that's olfactory bulb and hippocampus. The brain gets 20% of the blood flow, our blood flow, and 25% of our total energy. The brain is in a skull, and it's actually floating. So it kind of blew my mind when I first found out that our brain is kind of floating and it's not attached to somewhere tight. And that's why sometimes people get into football accidents or car accidents. It's possible that they hit the front of their head, but the back of the brain gets damaged. And you would wonder why. It's because when something is floating, when you hit the front, then it's going to go and hit the back of the skull, so the back of the brain can get damaged. So our brain is actually floating in CSF, or cerebrospinal fluid. So we already talked about it has 2 kinds of cells, glia and neurons. Any questions so far? Yeah.
In infants, where does neurogenesis occur?
Where?
In infants, where does neurogenesis occur?
Everywhere. Yeah, so the whole brain is developing until the age of 25. So actually this part of if you look at the old slides or maybe current slides, there are 2 slides on development that I'm happy for you that Dr. Perry got rid of it, because it's just kind of hard. So again, if I get to a slide and it was different from yours, if anybody is looking, then those would be them. Yeah.
After this, would we be able to upload this one with the background?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So I'm sorry. So I didn't realize because I made those on Mac and then I opened them on Windows or Linux, and then I figured out that when you use the PowerPoint one, there's this bright white kind of light thing in the middle that doesn't let you see. But if you do the PDF, if you look at the I will still send you these because they're easier. But if you look at the PDF, then that doesn't happen. I apologize for it. I don't know. In Mac, it wasn't that way. But so yeah, I will upload them or email them to everybody. So there are, like, neuroscientists just want it to be difficult and didn't want to just say on top of or below or behind. They came up with these words. I think they come from Greek or Latin. To when you talk about different parts of the brain, you want to say what is where compared to what. They use these terms that you want to know these terms, and we're going to like use them throughout this, especially this neuroanatomy class. A lot, so.
You don't have to know these like terms, like for like what terms, like the olfactory versus like
Right now you don't, but when we get into senses, so when we talk about vision or sense of smell or whatever, then there are pathways. So you want to know that first, like light goes into photoreceptors, and then from there to bipolar cells, and then yang. So you want to know the pathway from your sensory organ into the brain, what it is. But for this exam, we're not there yet. So whatever is in these slides is pretty much what you need to know for the exam. Yes.
I'm looking at the question, and then one of them was the same side versus opposite side. What were those?
Yeah, we'll get there. Yeah. Okay. So neuraxis is this line that you see. First, it's horizontal. So when you look at the brain, it cuts it to a top part and a bottom part. But then it goes into the spinal cord, and then it cuts the spinal cord into the like a front part and back part. So if you just visually look at this line, that's neuraxis. So a line down through the length of the central nervous system. And there is another line that is completely perpendicular to neuraxis called transverse, and it's kind of like if this is a brain and I put it on the table, if I treat it like a bread and try to slice it like a bread, those slices that are vertical, those are transverse. So you want to know that when it comes to the brain, neuraxis is this one that splits it to top part and bottom part. And then transverse, the opposite. So if you go like this in this guy's brain, then that would be the transverse. So anterior, when you say anterior or rostral, means towards the front. So when something is anterior compared to something else, that means it's in front of it, or rostral. The opposite of it is posterior. So it's kind of like if you know post, that means like back. So posterior means behind, and caudal is the same thing. So caudal or posterior means towards the back, and anterior or rostral is towards the front. And then we also have dorsal, that means on top of something, and ventral, that means below something.
Do you mind to explain the transverse is something like a good example? Is it like horizontal?
So imagine like if you have a brain, you put a brain on the table, which is the way it is. Imagine it's the same as if you put a piece of bread. How do you slice the bread? That's that kind of slicing. The brain is transverse. And the opposite would be the neuron. Yeah, that's so we have dorsal towards the top, ventral towards the bottom, and then lateral and medial, I think are easy, right? Medial, middle, and lateral to the side. So again, just memorizing, mostly. So brain is encased in skull, which is a bony thing that covers your brain is floating in cerebrospinal fluid and covered with meninges. So there are 3 layers that are protecting the brain. They're called meninges. And so this is very important. This order is from the surface of the brain outward. So closest to the brain is the pia mater. In the middle is arachnoid membrane. And then all the way outer one next to the skull would be dura mater. And I think one good way to memorize this is that dura is kind of like durable, so it's hard. So it's like skull, and then dura mater, and then arachnoid, and then pia mater. So pia mater closest to the brain, dura mater, the most outer part. Yeah.
And the cerebrospinal fluid is in between pia and dura?
It's pretty much everywhere. Like all the neurons have it around them, spinal cord has it around them, and the ventricles.
Okay.
It's everywhere. Yeah.
I'm sorry to go, talk about the last slide, but you said transverse would be like from right to left in the middle, or would it be
Vertical. So this way. So see, if you look at this picture, this, oops.
Because for some reason, every time I look up transverse, like anywhere online, it says it's like if they were to divide the body into upper and lower halves.
Human is like this, vertical. That would be like this.
So see, the neuroxis is this one, where you can see here in this picture. So that is splitting the brain this way, and when something is perpendicular, it splits it this way. So like slicing a bread. That's at least what's in your book. So I'll Google it later and see what you found.
But how is it on the exam?
Just learn this for the exam. Yeah, just ignore Google. It may look like it's different in humans, but that's because our brain kind of, when the spinal cord comes up, it does this, and then there's our brain. But in that crocodile or whatever, they're all lined. So neuroxis in that animal is a straight line, but in us, it first goes like this and it's like that. But then this goes with the transverse. Good? Wait. Okay. Yeah, so you want to know the order of meninges, not only their names, but their order as well, okay? We have ventricles in the brain, which are like hollow chambers that they produce, the cerebrospinal fluid is produced in there. And there are lateral ones, third and fourth ventricles. So cerebrospinal fluid is made in all the ventricles, not just like one or two in all of them. It's produced by choroid plexus and reabsorbed by arachnoid granulation. So I want to know these. There are different divisions of the brain. Depends if you're looking from a developmental standpoint, then there's a different categorization. If you look at but the major divisions are forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain that we'll get into. So the ventricles, yeah.
I have a quick question. I was looking at the bullet point I sent to over, and it said to describe the production, circulation, and reabsorption of CSF. As long as we know that it's produced by all four ventricles, we're good.
And they're produced by what and reabsorbed by what? So produced by choroid plexus and reabsorbed by arachnoid granulation. So the forebrain, the ventricles of the forebrain are lateral and third, and from a developmental standpoint, it's in telencephalon and diencephalon. And the structures in the forebrain are the cortex, basal ganglia, limbic system, thalamus, and hypothalamus. Midbrain, the ventricle cerebral aqueduct is not actually a whole ventricle, but it's a part of ventricular system in the midbrain. And midbrain is mesencephalon, and the structures of it are tectum and tegmentum. So later in the course, you're going to go into details about all of these. But right now, if you know this, is enough. And then hindbrain, the ventricle is the fourth. Mesencephalon and myelencephalon, and hindbrain has cerebellum, pons, and medulla oblongata, or medulla for short. The forebrain, so as you saw, forebrain is the biggest part and has most structures compared to the other part. Not that it's more important. Actually, midbrain is very important from survival. But there are more to remember about the forebrain. The subdivision, telencephalon, that is cerebral cortex, limbic system, and basal ganglia, and diencephalon, that has thalamus and hypothalamus. The cortex has 6 layers. Okay, so remember the first class, it was all about history and people and stuff that he said you don't need to know for the exam? But no, that the person that found out that the cortex has 6 layers was Cajal. So Cajal found out first that the cortex has 6 layers. So on the cerebral cortex, as you know, the brain, this is what it looks like. It's convoluted, so it allows for more surface in a smallest area. Sulci are the small grooves, like these little grooves are called sulci. Fissures are the large grooves, like this one in the middle, and there's one here, and there's one here. So the larger grooves are fissure, and gyri are where it's like swollen, where it comes up, bulges. So the cortex, or cerebral cortex, has 4 lobes: frontal lobe, parietal, occipital, and temporal. So okay, so for senses, pretty much all senses in the brain have a primary region that receives those senses, like for example vision. So the visual information first go to the primary visual cortex, and then there are secondary parts that the primary part is where they're involved in receiving the information, raw information, and then there are association parts that analyze the information, make sense of it, and put all these little pieces that are hitting your eye together and make it look like a room that you can recognize, like analyze the information. So the primary visual cortex, also called striate cortex or V1, is here in the back of the brain. So from the eyes goes to the back of the brain. Actually stops at thalamus like everything else, but we'll get there. There is a primary auditory cortex on the lower surface of the lateral fissure. So see, we're using these words, so it helps you kind of like memorize them better. Lower surface of the lateral fissure. This is the lateral fissure because we said that lateral means on the side and fissures are the deep grooves. So lateral fissure would be this one. And when we say it's on the lower surface of this, that means over here. So that's where the primary auditory cortex is. You're not going to have like pictures to label or anything on the exam, but you want to know. Yeah, but you want to know. And then we have primary somatosensory cortex, that the messages from your sensory organs, like your skin, your muscles, go to the somatosensory cortex. That's just caudal to the central sulcus. So this is the central sulcus, and the somatosensory cortex is caudal to it. That means it's the back of it, behind it, right? So this purple one. Insular cortex, where we sense of taste and like all the eating information go, is base of the somatosensory cortex, and insular cortex is over here, the little blue that you see in the green. And olfactory bulb is ventral to frontal lobes. So olfactory bulbs right here. So sense of smell is the only one that doesn't go through thalamus to get to the primary region in the brain that is going to receive it. Question? Okay, so the information for all our senses except for gustation and olfaction. So other than taste and smell, all the other senses are contralateral. That means information from the right side of the body travel to the left side of the brain and vice versa. So these words are kind of like, kind of explain themselves. When lateral means side, right? Remember? So contralateral means contrast, that means opposite, so opposite side. So contralateral means it goes to the opposite side of the brain. So when it touches my right hand, the message goes to the left brain, and when I look at you with my left eye, the message goes to the right brain. That's contralateral. The opposite would be ipsilateral, when something goes from the same side of the body to the same side of the brain. So you want to know that everything other than olfaction and gustation travels contralaterally. Okay, so sensory association areas are different from the primary areas. They're not directly involved in receiving the sensory information, but then they analyze and integrate the information from the primary sensory areas. So they tell you the location of the sensory information that you're receiving. Perception, remembering, learning, acting, all the more sophisticated, a little higher level cognitively stuff happen in association areas. So we have visual and then visual association, auditory and auditory association, sensory, the same, motor. So one example that is important, hint, hint, is that Broca's area is responsible for production of speech, not understanding, but producing speech. It's an example of, it's one of the association areas. So motor regions are the regions that send a message to your muscles for your involuntary movements. So you tell your hand to grab this, or tell your feet to walk, or whatever it might be, right? So we have primary motor cortex that is right in front of primary somatosensory. So sensory here, motor is here. That's the primary region. Connection between the brain and the muscles, and that's contralateral, like we said. And then we have motor, and then we have motor association areas that also called premotor cortex. So motor association and premotor are the same thing. They control primary motor cortex, and they control behavior. So again, a little more sophisticated. The primary regions are kind of dumb. They just take the raw information and they give it to the association areas, and association areas kind of make sense of it. So motor association cortex or premotor, yeah, I already said that. So prefrontal cortex is very important. It's from an evolutionary standpoint, the most recent part of the brain that we developed. So if you look at primates, like monkeys and stuff, one major difference that our foreheads usually goes up more flat versus theirs goes like this, because their prefrontal cortex is not as big as ours. And it's believed to be what's responsible for making us the smartest is pretty much prefrontal cortex, because to plan, to make tools, to understand cause and effect, that if this, then this, we can do it, but animals can't. They're just impulsive. They just go by impulse. So they're important for formulating plans, strategies, reasoning, and cause and effect. The roles of prefrontal cortex. So we have limbic system. Limbic system's all this orange parts here. All together, they make limbic system. The structures are hippocampus, amygdala, fornix, and mammillary bodies. So later on in the course, you will have to learn one by one what all these do, but not yet. And altogether, the functions of the limbic system is for emotion and for learning and memory. Remember we said hippocampus is the only part besides olfactory bulb that makes new neurons because it needs to learn new things. So here's hippocampus, and emotion and learning and memory are the roles of the limbic system in general. I'm sorry if you guys can't hear me very well because I try to figure out if I can do the laser pointer so I don't have to stand over here, but I couldn't figure it out, so I hope everybody can hear me. So the next part of the forebrain is basal ganglia. Basal ganglia are all these nuclei here. So nucleus means a population of neurons that are related and do the same thing. They're physically close to each other and they do the same thing. Nucleus, and the plural is nuclei. So when I say nuclei, that's what it means. Just a bunch of neurons that play the same role. They work together. They do the same thing. So basal ganglia has subcortical nuclei, and its function is control of movement. So a lot of movement disorders happen because the basal ganglia is damaged. The major parts of basal ganglia are caudate, putamen, and globus pallidus. So again, it's just memorizing. So we are still in forebrain. Then we have thalamus and hypothalamus, but thalamus and hypothalamus will be parts of diencephalon. Now we are out of the telencephalon. So thalamus has thalamic nuclei that are lateral geniculate nucleus, or LGN for short. Most people call it LGN. That's where the visual information goes first from your eyes before it goes to primary visual cortex. So it's the eyes, then thalamus, LGN part of the thalamus, which is the lateral geniculate nucleus, and then from there to the primary visual cortex. So it basically relays visual information to primary visual cortex. There is medial geniculate nucleus, or MGN, that does this for audition. So the information from your ears go to your primary auditory cortex. They go through this part of thalamus, MGN. And see, my slides messed up again. Sorry about that. Whoops. Okay, so there's also ventroanterior and ventrolateral nuclei are also parts of thalamus that they rely information from the basal ganglia and cerebellum to primary motor cortex. So like we just talked about, basal ganglia and cerebellum we will talk about, we haven't yet. They are responsible for balance and movement and all the things that your muscles need to do. And so the information goes to the primary motor cortex, right? Or, yeah. Hypothalamus is this little part, but it plays a huge role. All of the things that species do for survival take place in hypothalamus. So autonomic nervous system is a part of our nervous system that is not voluntary. So we don't consciously sit there and make our heart beat, right? Or our stomach and intestines move. They do it on their own. So that's why it's called autonomic. So we don't do it. It does itself. So autonomic nervous system, kind of hypothalamus is what that stuff takes place. Endocrine system is where you release hormones and stuff. Like an example would be pituitary glands, and behaviors related to survival, like feeding, fighting, fleeing, and mating. The one book said 4 Fs, but feeding, fighting, fleeing, and mating. So whatever has to do with survival. I need to learn to work with PowerPoint a little better. I don't know why it does that. Okay. So midbrain is a part of mesencephalon, and the structures are tectum and tegmentum. Tectum includes superior and inferior colliculi that is involved in vision and audition, respectively. So superior for vision and inferior for audition. And tegmentum includes reticular formation, responsible for arousal, attention, and our reflexes. Periaqueductal gray matter, responsible for sequences of movement, like movements that are sequential. You need to know, do first this and then that, right, where the sequence is important. And red nucleus, takes motor information from cerebral cortex and cerebellum and take it to the spinal cord and then to the organs. And substantia nigra projects to basal ganglia. Let's try this again. So the hindbrain has cerebellum and pons. Cerebellum is this little part. If you look at it, it's like a miniature brain. So that's why like cerebellum versus cerebral. Cerebellar would have to do with cerebellum, and cerebral would have to do with the cortex. It's like a tongue twister, especially for me. So cerebellum, the structures in the cerebellum are cerebellar cortex and deep cerebral nuclei. They're responsible for standing, walking, and coordinated movement. So when you walk, it's like a coordinated movement. When this leg goes, this arm goes back, and so on. And then they're attached to pons by cerebellar peduncles. So these are cerebral peduncles that attach cerebellum to pons. Pons contain a part of reticular formation and are responsible for arousal and sleep, and rely from cortex to cerebellum. So bring things from the cortex to the cerebellum. Again, I promise you, the rest of your course is not going to be boring like this. It's going to be like more tangible things to understand, not just memorize. But here we are, anatomy. Okay. Hindbrain also has medulla oblongata, or medulla for short, that is responsible for emotional, how like senses relate to emotions. Do you ever hear music that you heard during a certain part of your time of your life, and you just really feel that way, like you're there? Or you smell a smell, like somebody used to wear this cologne or whatever, and then you smell it, and it's just like it makes you very much feel that way. So the emotional aspect of senses happen in medulla. It's located most caudal portion of the brain. So we said caudal means underneath. So it's right here between the brain and the spinal cord. Immediately rostral to the spinal cord. So caudal to the brain, rostral to the spinal cord. Responsible for regulation of cardiovascular system and respiration and movement of skeletal muscles. So then after the brain, so that was really, really short description of the anatomy of the brain. So then we get to the spinal cord, which is also a part of the central nervous system. The function of the spinal cord is to carry sensory fibers to brain and motor fibers to muscles and glands. So sensory fibers are which one? Afferent or afferent? sensory? Afferent, yes, exactly. So in this picture, you can see that some are red and some are blue. So some are taking information from the brain to the organ, some are taking information from the sensory organ to the brain. To the muscles and glands, there is a dorsal root of spinal cord and the ventral root. Dorsal carries sensory fibers and information primarily from somatosensory system, and the nerve cell bodies are located in dorsal root ganglia. The ventral root carries motor fibers, so does the opposite, brings motor commands from the brain to the organs. Carry motor fibers and motor commands to muscles, and the nerve cell bodies for the ventral ones are located in the spinal gray matter. So yeah, this picture I thought was really good. It just shows that the red ones are the sensory ones, so taking things up to the brain, and then the blue ones taking things down from the brain to the organs. Unfortunately, you want to know these different parts of the spinal cord and spine, but you don't have to know how many, but you just want to know the names in order. So from top to bottom, there's cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal. From top to bottom. So from bottom to top, it would be the opposite. But you want to memorize these. So the peripheral nervous system starts with cranial nerves. Cranial nerves come out of the bottom of the brain, and actually out of 12 pairs, only one of them goes anywhere beside head and neck. So all 11 pairs of the cranial nerves control head and neck functions, and only one of them, called vagus nerves, goes down and control the rest of the body. So 12 pairs, they're attached to the ventral surface of the brain. That's obvious. Sensory and motor functions primarily of the head and neck, except for one of them, vagus nerve, that controls the internal organs. Some of the cranial nerves only carry sensory information, and some of them only carry motor information, but there are ones that do both, just like the vagus nerve. They're mixed, so mixed fibers, like vagus nerve is one of them. They do both, take sensory information to the brain and motor information down from the brain. Like the ones that are just blue or just red, versus the ones that have both. See, so these are the mixed ones. These are the ones that only do one. Yeah.
Do you have to know which one is sensory versus motor versus both out of the 12?
You're talking about specifically in this picture. So
Yeah.
see, when you're talking about sensory, you're talking about your senses. So when it's something has to do with the eyes, what do eyes do? They sense. So they see things, and then that information goes to the brain, so it's sensory or afferent from the organ. But when something comes from the brain to the organ, like tell your this muscle to flex or whatever, so that would be afferent or motor. But no, it's not like. Are you talking about say out of the 12 pairs? This one is sensory, that one's motor, that one's mixed. You don't need to know. I don't even know. I don't have them memorized. Later, there will be certain ones that you will want to know when you learn the pathways. That when you taste things, which cranial nerves are the ones that primarily take the taste information and take it to the brain. 11 or whatever, but not yet. You don't need to know. And then you're not going to learn all of them unless you want to. So where are we? So all of them head and neck except for that one. And so the autonomic nervous system, or ANS, is the part of the nervous system that our body does it by itself. We don't do it voluntarily. So regulate smooth muscles. Smooth muscles are, in general, we have 3 types of muscles. Skeletals are the ones that are attached to bones, and we command them to move. And then we have cardiac muscle. That is just its own thing, but that does its own thing. We don't voluntarily or consciously make our heart beat, right? And then we have smooth muscles that are like your guts, your all the internal organs, stomach or skin or your vessels and all that. So regulate smooth muscles, cardiac muscles, and endocrine glands. So it regulates your hormones too, release of hormones. There are 2 main divisions of ANS are sympathetic and parasympathetic. They have opposite effects. So sympathetic is, when people do things that are exciting, they say they like the adrenaline rush. So when you're in a fight or flight mode, your body is in the sympathetic mode. What it does is it uses as much, so imagine like a tiger is chasing you, right? So you use as much energy as possible to run fast, then your heart is beating faster, your blood vessels are like loose, let more blood go, and the oxygen reaches your brain and stuff. You're expending, you're using energy with the sympathetic division. So it's involved with expenditure of energy. It regulates adrenal medulla that is responsible for your fight or flight mode. And motor neurons project from gray matter of the thoracic and lumbar spinal cord parts of the spinal cord and go to the final target organ. And you want to know that the neurotransmitter for sympathetic division is adrenaline or epinephrine, the same thing. There are 2 names for the same thing. So, and learn what the neurotransmitter is for each of them. And then we have parasympathetic division of ANS that does the opposite. So when you eat food, you're relaxing, nothing exciting going on. Then your stomach starts digesting food. Then your heart beats slower, just chilling. Your blood's not running, your heart's not running. And more of your digesting food and stuff takes place when you're relaxing. So involved in increasing body's stored energy. So you're storing energy. And then salivation, secretion of digestive juices, and blood flow to the gastrointestinal tract. So blood flow when you're in a fight or flight is more in your muscles and stuff to help you run, to your heart to beat faster, so you get more oxygen to your brain. In the parasympathetic, it's the opposite. Your blood flow is more around your stomach and stuff, lets you gain energy and reserve energy. And the motor neurons project from cranial nerves, in this case vagus nerve, and sacral region of the spinal cord to parasympathetic ganglia that is near the target organ. And the neurotransmitter here is acetylcholine. Okay,